So yesterday I put out a poll asking you guys if you guys have had all of your fantasy football drafts already leading up to the season. And more than 50% of you actually said no, that you have not drafted all of your fantasy football teams this season. So we need to do one last video about fantasy football draft season, and then starting this Sunday, we will be all in on week 1 fantasy football. So today we need to go through the best picks round by round in 2023 fantasy football drafts right now. So we're going to start out with our first guy on the list in round 1. It's Stefon Diggs of the Buffalo Bills here. Now, honestly, guys, it would be really easy for me to come out and say Justin Jefferson is the best pick, right? Christian McCaffrey's the best pick. Jamar Chase is the best pick. The reality, though, is only the top 3 people in your draft have the ability to draft those types of people, right? Like, you're not going to be able to get Christian McCaffrey at the 110. You're not going to be able to get Justin Jefferson at the 109. You're not going to be able to get Jamar Chase at the 112 of your draft. That's just simply not going to happen. This is the type of guy Stefon Diggs is. That is going in the end of the first round of drafts right now. In most platforms, he's going at the back of the first round. That's insane to me because when you look at Stefon Diggs over the past 3 years since he has been a Buffalo Bill, he's been one of the most consistent fantasy football receivers in the entire NFL. You're talking about the wide receiver 4 finish last year, the wide receiver 7 finish in 2021, and the wide receiver 3 finish in 2020. Every year that he's been in Buffalo, he has been a top 8 fantasy football wide receiver, and last year he had 15.7 fantasy points per game, and he was also 4th in total targets in the entire NFL as well. This guy is obviously, no doubt about this, the clear number 1 wide receiver in Buffalo, but he also has a clear top 3 ceiling in fantasy football. This guy could finish as high as the wide receiver 3 or even the wide receiver 2 if things break his way. Stefon Diggs' ceiling is so high, and you're getting a guy with the top 3 ceiling literally at the back half of your draft, like the back half of the first round of your draft. At the end of round 1 is where you can get a guy like this. I simply love this pick at Stefon Diggs here at the back of the first round. Now moving on to our round 2 guy. This is a guy that I love getting in round 2. It's Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders. Now here's the thing about the round 2 guys. There was another guy that I wrestled with in round 2 being in this particular pick, and it was actually AJ Brown. When you look at AJ Brown specifically on ESPN, AJ Brown is going at the back half of the second round as well. A wide receiver with top 5 upside. I decided to go with Josh Jacobs here because this guy, unlike AJ Brown, where I could see a top 5 ceiling, maybe a top 4 ceiling for AJ Brown, Josh Jacobs has legitimate running back 1 upside. He proved last year. I mean, look at what he did last year on the screen. Almost 24 touches a game. Almost 125 yards per game. Almost 18 fantasy points per game for the running back 3 finish. And last year was last year, right? Whatever. Last year was last year. You can't go back and take what he did and apply it to this year. This year, though, he doesn't have any red flags. You're looking at a guy who's 25 years old, so he's at that age. He's at a peak age for running backs here. And he also is heading into another contract year. So he's going to come in just as motivated as he was last year because he is in seek of a long-term contract. Keeping those guys hungry, especially the running back position, is when you see some of the best fantasy seasons for running backs here. And he's not going to lose volume this year. Zamir White is not going to come out of nowhere like he didn't last year and just all of a sudden take over Josh Jacobs' volume. This team knows that they needed Josh Jacobs, and that's why they signed him. Josh Jacobs is going to be fantastic for this team. And let me clarify again. AJ Brown is a great pick in the second round as well. But this pick right here, Josh Jacobs in the second, this is simply just a money pick right here. Now moving on to round 3, man. I absolutely love this pick right here. It's Chris Olave of the New Orleans Saints right here. This is one of my most top pick players of fantasy football in 2023. I have so many shares of Chris Olave throughout all platforms. Yahoo leagues, sleeper leagues, ESPN leagues, underdog leagues. I've got tons and tons of Chris Olave. When you look at what he did last year, it was obviously impressive. The guy was a rookie and he finished as a top 25 wide receiver. But this is the real deal, man, because he did this with a combination of Jameis Winston and Andy Dalton as his quarterbacks, guys. He had no stable quarterback one. And the reality is also, when you're dealing with two quarterbacks, you can never establish chemistry with either of them. As a wide receiver, it is pivotal for you to be able to establish chemistry with one quarterback that you know can trust and that you know will know your tendencies as a wide receiver and you will know their tendencies as a quarterback, man. And listen, here's the thing about Derek Carr. Derek Carr, obviously now the quarterback one in New Orleans. A lot of people don't love Derek Carr. I've been saying this all offseason. I understand why people don't love Derek Carr, the player. But here are a few awesome realities associated with Derek Carr. Derek Carr has supported 3 top 12 wide receivers when he was with Oakland/Las Vegas. Amari Cooper, Devontae Adams last year, and Hunter Renfrow. Yes, Hunter Renfrow was a top 12 wide receiver in full PPR in 2021. That's Derek Carr's reality right here. And he also has a very good deep ball. And you know what? This pairs perfectly with Chris Olave, who had 29 deep targets in 2022, which was good for 4th overall in the NFL, and he had an average depth of target of 14.0 yards. That is Chris Olave's reality with Derek Carr. This is a perfect fit for these two guys, man. And obviously, Chris Olave is the wide receiver one. Do not let anyone tell you that Michael Thomas is the wide receiver one in this offense anymore. It's simply not true. Chris Olave, clear wide receiver one in this offense, clearly has real top 5 upside as a fantasy wide receiver in 2023. Now, moving on to round 4, there was a lot of strong candidates in this round. When you're looking at a couple different platforms, there are several strong candidates in round 4. But the choice is definitely Justin Fields of the Chicago Bears right here. Guys like Ramondre Stevenson and Amari Cooper were very, very strong contenders here. And even Justin Herbert, also another quarterback going in this range, which, by the way, if you don't get Justin Fields, I love Justin Herbert as well. But none of these guys has the ability and the upside and the potential to break fantasy football in 2023. I've said this over the offseason. I've made several videos on why I believe Justin Fields will break fantasy football in 2023. We are talking about a guy who is excellent starting week 7 against New England on Monday night. I watched that game, and that's when I saw the evolution of Justin Fields as a fantasy player. That's when he started dominating, and he was consistently dominant ever since then. And now he's getting DJ Moore on this team. This is going to help unlock Justin Fields, and vice versa with DJ Moore as well. This team has said all offseason that Justin Fields looks like a brand new quarterback. They say he looks completely comfortable in the pocket, and he's obviously still got the playmaking ability. I have tons of Justin Fields in 2023 fantasy football, and I advise you to do the same if you've got a draft coming up this weekend. Now, moving on to the 5th round, I've got Breece Hall of the New York Jets right here. So here's the reality with Breece Hall real quick. I get why he fell. I get why he's fallen in drafts. Obviously, they signed Dalvin Cook, the New York Jets did. And Dalvin Cook, honestly, I think most of us accept that he can still be a really impactful contributor on an NFL team. I mean, the contract that they gave him proves what they think about him, and it also proves that Dalvin Cook is not all of a sudden going to be irrelevant in this offense at some point this season. Unless Dalvin Cook is injured, he's going to be involved in some form or shape. And I would imagine that most of his involvement and most of his fantasy value is going to come early in the season while Breece Hall is still recovering from the knee injury. But that's the thing about Breece Hall. The 5th round is a great value for Breece Hall. We are talking about a guy who is a 22-year-old running back. When you look back to his rookie season in 2022, he averaged 15.1 fantasy points per game. So when you look at that from a running back perspective, that is the running back 7 in fantasy points per game last year. That is fantastic work on a guy who was a rookie last year, was really brought along slowly as well last year. While he was sharing touches with Michael Carter, he was brought along plenty slowly. Well, obviously, by mid-season, by really like week 5 or 6, this team figured out that he's clearly the best running back in this backfield. It doesn't change here with a guy like Dalvin Cook. Now this team is honestly in the perfect situation where since they've got a guy like Dalvin Cook, they can let Breece Hall just heal up and get fully healthy by like week 6, week 8 during the season. And that's when I believe he starts to give you the real fantasy football value that honestly could win leagues. Breece Hall is going to come through big for you in the second half of the season. That is what I expect to happen with a guy like Breece Hall. And the round 5 is simply late enough to pick a guy like Breece Hall to where you can accept the early season lull that he will have when you can get that late season upside that I'm talking about. So round 5 for Breece Hall, fantastic pick. Now moving on to round 6, I've got Alexander Madison of the Minnesota Vikings here. Also, very strong contenders here in round 6. You're looking at guys like Dallas Goedert, James Cook, Javonte Williams. All these guys have plenty of upside on their side. But I had to go with my running back 11 here. I had to. The running back 11 on my board is Alexander Madison, and there's a lot of good reasons for it. First of all, one thing that a lot of people don't look this deep into, and I think this is a lot of fantasy analysts' fault for not showing you guys this particular information, but one thing that's super important to note is that throughout Alexander Madison's career, when he has played at least 50% of the offensive snaps, in other words, when he is filled in for Dalvin Cook, he averages 22 fantasy points per game when he plays at least 50% of the offensive snaps on a given week. That is remarkable work for Alexander Madison. And here's the reality, and the reason he gets that many fantasy points per game is because whenever he goes in, he experiences the full 3-down workload that Dalvin Cook once had in Minnesota. So now Dalvin Cook is gone. Alexander Madison is officially going to be this team's 3-down back. A guy who is going to get at least 20 touches a game for this particular offense, and he's a very good receiving back as well. He's going to provide you with that receiving upside, and the other reality is that he's going into the season with a top 10 offensive line in Minnesota. Do not overthink this one, man. I know a lot of people have been saying that Alexander Madison is overrated and he's really just an average guy, but look at the workload that's coming for him. Look at what he does when he gets at least 50% of the snaps. This is the safest workload out of any running back in round 6, and he really does have a tremendous amount of upside. Now moving on to round 7, I've got Christian Kirk of the Jacksonville Jaguars here. This is the round I probably had the toughest time picking the particular guy I was going to go with here. I love the wide receivers in this round. I also love some of the running backs in this round. You're looking at guys like Drake London, David Montgomery, J.K. Dobbins, George Pickens. Honestly, I wanted to cheat here and put Drake London with Christian Kirk as the 1A to Christian Kirk's 1, but I'm not going to cheat here. I have to stick with Christian Kirk because I do believe that Christian Kirk will finish higher than Drake London this year. Guys, look back to what Christian Kirk did last year. On the screen, you can see that he was the wide receiver 11 in half PPR. Christian Kirk also signed a 4-year, $72 million contract last year with $37 million guaranteed. So he's not all of a sudden just going to go away into the second year of his contract. He's not all of a sudden just going to be this distant wide receiver 2 in Jacksonville. Because here's the reality, I will not deny this with Calvin Ridley. At one time, Calvin Ridley was a better fantasy wide receiver than Christian Kirk was last year. And this last year was Christian Kirk's best season as a fantasy wide receiver. Yes, at one time, Calvin Ridley was the better fantasy wide receiver of the two. So if I don't deny that, and I can accept that, I need some of you to accept who are the Calvin Ridley truthers out there. You cannot deny that his last full year was in 2020. You also cannot deny that he's 28 years old now, and he missed all of last season, and he missed half of the 2021 season. This is not a situation where they stick this guy in a freezer and he just doesn't age during that time. This guy aged. He's 28 years old. He didn't just all of a sudden just stop aging. He didn't stop the aging process. Calvin Ridley is older now. And the history of players coming off one full season that they missed time, not necessarily due to an injury, but a holdout situation, whatever the case may be. You look back to guys like Le'Veon Bell, Michael Thomas, Deshaun Watson, all of those guys, their first year back, they were not good either from a performance standpoint or from an injury standpoint, because the reality is, when you step back into the NFL after missing over a full season of work, your body is not ready to go right away. So either you're not good entirely, or you will get injured again. The history is against Calvin Ridley here, and Christian Kirk just simply is a great value here in the 7th round, and he's on a fantastic offense. There's no way that you can convince me Christian Kirk is not a great pick here in the round 7. So moving on to round 8, we are going to end it off here with Jackson Smith-Njigba of the Seattle Seahawks. Man, listen, I told you, I could not promise you guys that I would not bring up Jackson Smith-Njigba again this offseason before the season starts. Jackson Smith-Njigba is my 2nd most drafted player in 2023. I've got Jackson Smith-Njigba all over the freaking place in 2023. I love Jackson Smith-Njigba, and the reality here is that he may be going in the 9th round by the time you draft, if you have a draft this weekend. He is a guy that is actually still falling in drafts because of the wrist surgery that he just had. But what a lot of people don't know, and I actually learned this tonight when I was at a live draft myself, talking to one of my league mates, he did not know that Jackson Smith-Njigba was already back to fully practicing just days after his wrist surgery. Just days after. Pete Carroll said this guy is simply not going to be denied. And you know what? He's exactly right. When you look back to 2021, his sophomore season as an Ohio State Buckeye, it was simply amazing what he did, and he did it in a legendary wide receiver room. Guys like junior year Garrett Wilson, senior year Chris Olave, freshman year Marvin Harrison Jr., and freshman year Emeka Egbuka. And Jackson Smith-Njigba was the guy you could not take your eyes off of in 2021. And the reality is, if he was able to come out of the draft and come into the draft of 2022, he would have been a top 10 pick. Last year, didn't play at all as a junior, really, and he dropped to the 20th pick in the draft. Seattle got a massive steal right here, and Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave both say that Jackson Smith-Njigba is actually the better wide receiver than both of them. And you know what? They're right. I came out very strong earlier in the offseason when I said I believe Jackson Smith-Njigba will be better right out of the gate in fantasy football than DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. I came out really strong, turned a lot of people off by saying that. But the reality is, I truly, truly do believe it here. But the reality is, even if he isn't better than them, right? Even if he isn't better than one of them. Let's say he's not better than DK Metcalf. Let's say that DK Metcalf is a top 12 wide receiver and Jackson Smith-Njigba is the wide receiver 16, wide receiver 17. That's tremendous to get here in round 8. But the reality here is, like I said, I believe this guy is going to be a top 15 wide receiver, and he will be the best wide receiver on the Seattle Seahawks from a fantasy football perspective. And the late season value here is inevitable if this guy stays healthy. So let me know who you are actively targeting and actively avoiding in your fantasy football drafts in 2023. And if you want to see the top 30 running back rankings for 2023 fantasy football, click on this video right here.